Hey guys, welcome to another installment of Hilliard at Home. Today's topic is Freudian psychoanalytic theory, which has its roots in the post-humanist trends of the late 19th century and had a massive influence on 20th century ideas about human psychology and culture, and a whole lot of other things. So, before we get into who Freud was and what his theory of psychoanalysis was, it's important that we review a few key terms that were covered in previous videos. Let's start with the concept of agency. Agency means the capacity for action or the power to change the conditions of one's existence, or to shape one's own destiny. The concept of agency was a central component of the history of humanism, which had its roots in classic Greek and Roman society, and then, after a long period of anti-humanist thinking in the medieval period, became the predominant worldview, at least within Western civilization, during the Renaissance period, the Enlightenment period, the Romantic period, and the Victorian period. Humanism is the idea that human beings, individually and collectively, have agency and should have the freedom to exercise it. It's an optimistic view of human progress achieved by unleashing the full potential of human agency. In other words, it's the idea that we can build better societies and better lives by giving people the freedom and resources to explore the world around them and act upon it. During the Victorian period of the late 19th century, however, we started to see the emergence of post-humanist ideas that challenged many of the basic assumptions of humanism. Post-humanism is not exactly against humanism. It's better to think of it as after or beyond humanism. Now, there's no standard definition of post-humanism, but the one we've been using is any philosophy or worldview that recognizes that human agency is limited by the fact that the human self is structured through its experiences within the social environments that it inhabits. Freud's psychoanalytic theory definitely fits within this post-humanist framework. Sigmund Freud was an Austrian psychologist who developed a theory of the unconscious that really transformed how we think about the human mind and the human self. Now, Freud wasn't the first person to suggest that there's an unconscious part of the mind. In fact, he was deeply influenced by French neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot, who used hypnosis in his research and practice. In this famous painting, he's demonstrating his technique for a group of fellow neurologists. Now, most people of the time period still understood the mind in Enlightenment terms as a mechanism for rational thought, a reasoning machine. We perceive things through our senses, then the mind uses reason to process those perceptions, generating the ideas, decisions, and behaviors that define us. Because this is a fully conscious process, the reasoning individual can be understood as an independent and self-aware agent who is fully accountable for his or her ideas, decisions, and behaviors. But hypnosis suggests that there are parts of our minds that operate in ways that we are not aware of and without any connection to rational thought. This is a very troubling idea for a humanist. If our ideas, decisions, and behaviors stem to some degree from unconscious and non-rational processes, then to what degree are we, as individuals, accountable for those ideas, decisions, and behaviors? The answer is not 0% accountable, but it's also not 100% accountable. It's somewhere in between. So, Freud understood the mind to be divided into two parts, the conscious mind and the unconscious mind, with the unconscious mind operating as a kind of container for taboo contents. Taboo contents are things like memories, impulses, and desires that society tells us we should not have. So when these things are locked away in the unconscious part of the mind, they're not only hidden from others, they're hidden from ourselves, hidden from the conscious part of our minds. For instance, in his famous theory of the Oedipus Complex, which we'll talk about in more detail later, Freud asserted that infants have a libido, or a sexual energy, and that the first object of sexual desire, for male and female infants alike, is the mother. As the child learns that this desire is wrong, or taboo, he or she locks it away in the unconscious part of the mind and becomes completely unaware of that desire. But here's the thing, it's still there, and it always will be. Freud argued that the taboo material in the unconscious mind is never actually eradicated, and that it is always trying to make its way into the conscious part of the mind. To combat this, we use a variety of defense mechanisms to prevent the unconscious material from emerging into the conscious mind. This is called repression, and it's something that we're constantly doing. But the process of repression is itself completely unconscious. We remain completely unaware of the taboo material that we repress and of the defense mechanisms that we use to repress them. So if we had to define repression, we'd say it's a continuous process of using unconscious defense mechanisms to keep taboo content in the unconscious part of the mind. So let's talk a bit about what these defense mechanisms are and how they work. Freud himself identified 10 different mechanisms, and others have added to that list or reconfigured it in various ways. We don't need to worry too much about what each of these mechanisms is, and honestly, I don't fully understand all of them myself. But it'll be helpful to cover a few key defense mechanisms in order to get a better understanding of Freud's larger theory. So, one very common defense mechanism would be negation, or reversal, where a taboo desire or memory is turned to its opposite. So, imagine a woman who falls in love with her husband's brother. But since this love is taboo, she unconsciously reverses that love so that it becomes an intense disgust, maybe even to the point that she gets physically ill when her husband's brother is around. Or imagine a woman who, as a child, calmly watched her infant sibling drown. The feelings of guilt and shame associated with that memory may be so intense that she has unconsciously reversed it and remembers herself heroically trying to rescue her sibling. In both cases, the person remains completely unaware or unconscious of the taboo desire or memory. Another common defense mechanism is projection, where some taboo or undesirable aspect of oneself is denied in the self and instead seen and despised in other people. So imagine a teenage boy who has homosexual desires but has been raised in a very homophobic environment. He might end up not only denying his homosexual desires, but also becoming one of the most extreme and violent homophobes around. He remains completely unaware of his own homosexual desires and instead fixates on any sign of homosexuality in others, hating them with an irrational intensity. Another defense mechanism that Freud identified was displacement or substitution, where the object of a taboo desire is replaced with a new object. So imagine a young boy who loves dresses and makeup, but is raised in a very gender-normative environment where he is taught that those things are not for boys. He might simply replace his love for dresses and makeup with a fascination for cars and trucks, maybe even to the point of it becoming an unhealthy fixation. In such a case, the boy's love for cars would actually be powered by his love for dresses and makeup, but he would have no memory or conscious awareness of that original desire. Finally, sublimation is a defense mechanism that Freud described as the most mature or healthy form of repression. It's when a taboo desire or behavior is transformed into something socially acceptable or even admirable. So, imagine a boy who likes to torture or even dismember small animals. To repress his desire to do these unacceptable things, he unconsciously transforms that desire into a fascination with the medical profession and eventually becomes a talented surgeon. So you can see that in each of these cases, the process of repression, which, again, is completely unconscious, produces new desires, new memories, new behaviors, and new character traits. In fact, Freud suggested that all of our desires and behaviors and character traits are the product of unconscious processes of repression. In other words, our whole personality, our whole self, takes shape through the workings of defense mechanisms that we are completely unaware of. So remember that rational enlightenment self who is fully self-aware and therefore fully accountable for his or her ideas, decisions, and behaviors? Well, hopefully we can see that the Freudian model of the human self is completely different from that. We should also be able to see that any notion of human agency within this model is incredibly complicated. For instance, if I decide to donate money to a charity, am I acting out of a genuine desire to do good? Or am I just repressing something undesirable or taboo about myself? And if it's really just repression, does my admirable behavior really make me any better than someone whose processes of repression generate less admirable behaviors? Neither of us made a conscious decision about how we would repress taboo content. This brings me to a couple of key points about psychoanalytic theory. The first point is that the processes of repression usually produce normal, healthy, or socially acceptable behaviors and character traits, though we should always understand these things to be considered normal or healthy according to the norms of a particular society, and those norms themselves might be flawed, oppressive, or unhealthy in various ways. Sometimes, however, the processes of repression produce traits or behaviors that are harmful in some way, or are considered abnormal, unhealthy, or socially unacceptable. These undesirable traits or behaviors are referred to as neuroses, and Freud understood the purpose of psychoanalysis to be to correct these neuroses. So that's the first key point. The second point regards a common misconception about Freudian psychoanalysis. Most people assume that psychoanalysis is supposed to work by making the analysand, that is, the patient, aware of the taboo material that they have repressed so that they can confront it in a conscious way. Freud, however, understood taboo material to be taboo for good reasons, which meant that bringing it into the conscious mind could be incredibly harmful. For Freud, then, the purpose of psychoanalysis is not to reveal the analysand's unconscious material, but rather to reorganize or restructure the processes of repression, to help the analysand develop new and better ways to keep that taboo material repressed. Now, some later theorists have taken issue with this because they understand taboos to be socially constructed, meaning that taboo material is not necessarily inherently evil or harmful, it's just regarded as evil or harmful by a particular society. For instance, in the 1970s, French feminist Hélène Cixous argued that a patriarchal society teaches women that the natural desires and impulses that come from their female bodies are dirty or monstrous, and need to be repressed in ways that ultimately shape the woman into that society's patriarchal image of a good and proper woman. In order to resist patriarchy, then, Cixous argued that women must explore their bodies' natural impulses and unleash all of that taboo content. Okay, so we've covered the basics of Freudian theory, but there are a couple of more specific components of Freud's thought that you should probably be aware of. If you've ever had any previous exposure to Freud, you're probably familiar with the terms id, ego, and superego. These terms refer to a description of the mind's architecture that Freud developed later in his career. Really, though, it's just another way to talk about the processes of repression. So, ego comes from the Latin term for the self, or I, and super means above, so the superego is above the self. Freud describes the id as an unconscious and chaotic realm of desires and impulses and memories. The superego is essentially what we might call our conscience. It's a part of the self that is structured through the messages that we receive from our social environment about what is right and wrong, what is normal and abnormal, and what is healthy and unhealthy. In other words, the superego tells us what components of the id are taboo and therefore must be repressed so that they remain unconscious. The ego, then, is the conscious self that takes shape through this interaction between the id and the superego. It's the product of all those processes of repression, and it's what each of us refers to as I or me. Another component of Freudian theory that you may be somewhat familiar with is the Oedipus Complex. Oedipus is a character from classic Greek mythology. If you've ever read the famous Greek tragedy Oedipus Rex, or Oedipus the King, by Sophocles, then you know that Oedipus's parents, the king and queen of Thebes, received a prophecy that their son would murder his father and marry his mother. Consequently, when they had a male child, they gave the infant to a shepherd, with instructions to kill the child. But the shepherd took pity on the child and gave him to another shepherd from another city. Now the second shepherd gave the boy to the king and queen of that city, and they raised him as if he were their own child. So the boy Oedipus grew to be a young man, and one day he received a prophecy that he would kill his father and defile his mother. So he fled his home to avoid this fate, not realizing that the parents he knew were not actually his real parents. Well, one thing leads to another, and sure enough, Oedipus ends up unknowingly killing his father and then marrying his mother. He becomes the king of Thebes and has 4 children with his own mother, 2 daughters and 2 sons. I know, gross. So, there's something about a sphinx mixed in there as well, and the queen committing suicide, and Oedipus gouging his own eyes out. But you get the gist of it. So, Freud suggested that it was no coincidence that this particular story was part of Greek mythology, and that similar stories were also told in other cultures. He suggested that all individuals go through a process by which their sexuality takes shape, and that the story of Oedipus is just one expression of a particular part of that process. He called this process as a whole the family romance. Now, the family romance begins with Freud's idea that the infant possesses a libido, or a sexual energy. In its original form, the libido has no specific object, but at some point, the libido fixes upon the mother as its first object of desire. And this is true for both male and female infants. Gradually, however, the child realizes that the mother, as an object of sexual desire, belongs to the father. With this realization, the male child develops a desire to kill the father and possess the mother, the whole Oedipus thing. But these desires are taboo, so the male child typically represses them through negation and displacement. He negates, or reverses, his hatred of the father, turning it into a love for the father, whom he identifies with and wants to become. He then substitutes his desire for his mother with a desire for other women. Thus, the male child, through these processes of repression, develops into a quote-unquote normal heterosexual male. But the unconscious mind still contains that original desire to possess the mother and kill the father, and these desires can manifest themselves in various types of dreams or behaviors over the course of the man's life. Again, Freud called this the Oedipus Complex and understood the story of Oedipus to be a product of this complex. But what about the female child? Remember that she also desires the mother, and like the male child, she eventually realizes that the mother, as an object of sexual desire, belongs to the father, the possessor of the penis. The female child realizes that she does not have a penis and develops what Freud called penis envy. She also blames the mother for having castrated her. Yes, you heard that right. So, this leads her to transfer her sexual desire to the father. Eventually, she comes to identify with her mother and develops a desire to bear a child. According to Freud, the desire to bear a child is a product of penis envy, with the child working as a sort of substitute for the missing penis. I know, it's weird, but whatever. Now, Freud understood this as the process by which a woman develops into a quote-unquote normal heterosexual female. One of Freud's most prominent students, Carl Jung, named this the Electra complex. Electra is another figure from Greek mythology who plotted to kill her mother, but Freud didn't like this name because, in his description of the complex, the female child never actually has a desire to kill the mother. So, sadly, I guess we don't need stick figures to show us the story of Electra. Now, Freud understood the family romance to be universal, meaning that it's something everyone experiences. But even if there is some truth to the family romance, not everyone is born into what we might consider a typical nuclear family structure with a mother and a father. So clearly not everyone's experience could be like the ones described in the Oedipus and Electra complexes. Furthermore, in many cultures, the nuclear family is not even the typical family structure, and children are raised within complex family and social networks that don't place so much emphasis on biological mothers and fathers. In those types of cultures, Freud's family romance would not really make much sense at all as an explanation of individual development. This issue with the family romance points back to that larger issue with Freud's psychoanalytic theory that I've already mentioned, the fact that it tends to accept existing social norms as universal standards. In other words, some of the things that Freud would call taboo or abnormal or unhealthy or neurotic are not inherently bad or problematic. They're just defined that way according to existing social norms that may themselves be flawed. As I mentioned before, recent theorists have attempted to remove this type of bias from psychoanalytic theory. Well, that wraps up our discussion of Freudian psychoanalytic theory. In just a moment, you should see in-video links to other Hilliard Home videos, and you can also find links to other videos in e-courses. You should also check e-courses for any quizzes, assignments, or discussion boards related to this video. Thanks for watching!